All right, welcome to another episode of Coffee with the Founder. May the 4th be with you edition. Got my coffee cup here, and also we have another great guest, a colleague, a friend, a true sister, in fact, and Diane Goodman. Diane, we're doing coffee talks with the founder just to introduce people to the great folks who are in our network, who are part of the WPC family. So we're glad you could be here. And we're going to get started. Let's just start by asking you, who are you? What do you do?
As you said, I'm Diane Goodman, and I have been a proud and loyal part of the White Privilege Conference and Privilege Institute. So my work has been educating in the broadest sense of that word around issues of, I used to call it diversity and social justice, now languages, equity and inclusion as well. And that has taken me in lots of different directions, as a faculty member, as an administrator in higher ed, as a consultant, as a trainer, as a facilitator, as a writer. But my work is always centered around how to be understanding and addressing issues of systemic inequities on all levels. And race and racism and racial equity has been one important part of that.
Yeah. I want to ask you a little bit about some of your writings and teachings, but before that, can you just tell us how you got to this point? Did you grow up thinking I was going to be a social justice consultant, advocate, professor? Like, how did you get here?
Yeah. So I think this is what I always wanted to do, but I didn't know it was something I could do. It was never on those little inventories you take that say, check, figure out your interests and you can, become a lawyer or a nurse or something. But I was always concerned about issues of fairness, and always was concerned about things that I thought were unfair. I was always interested in education and psychology and kind of wanting to change how people thought about things. And then got involved in feminism, which really opened my eyes to systemic inequities really through sexism, but through that avenue started to understand issues of race and sexuality and disability. And so looked for a graduate program that would allow me to do education, do consciousness raising around issues of inequity and social justice. I didn't know this existed, but I ended up at UMass Amherst that had a program in social justice education. And I also studied counseling there and group and organizational development, but that became home. And that's where I realized, oh, this is something people do for a living, and met great colleagues and role models. And that really launched me doing this work as a trainer and consultant, and then also moving into some faculty and other roles.
So can you give us a sense as a faculty member, what kind of courses, what are folks teaching when it comes to social justice, equity, the course titles? Give us a sense of that and what you're trying to accomplish over a semester.
So I'm actually not a faculty member at the moment. I have been in the past, currently not, and it has changed radically. One of my frustrations was that I didn't fit in any of the boxes. So when I was looking for faculty jobs way back when, this is the 80s and 90s, I never had the right credentials. I didn't fit in any of the departments. And at that point, people would talk about race. Someone would teach classes about, racial inequality. They were certainly talking about women's studies. Queer studies wasn't quite there yet. So, my classes were a little broader. Now I think it's radically different. I mean, as we know, there are classes that's specifically on whiteness studies and, around racism and white supremacy. And, I think we're in a very different place than we were. It might have been easier now to find a faculty job. I'm not looking for one at the moment. So I think academia has radically changed. And where I see that is both in my consulting work with people in academia, and I do a lot of faculty development, as well as in other organizations, I see a huge generational divide. That I see students who are graduating from college and graduate school now who at least have the language and the concepts of talking about whiteness, talking about racism, talking about queerness, talking about white supremacy, talking about white privilege. And the older folks, and I include myself in one of the older folks, they just, we just didn't have that. And so I find that younger folks are coming in with a whole different set of expectations about the conversations that need to be happening, about how they expect things to be structured, about the kind of things they want to be learning, that people who didn't grow up with that content are really at a loss. And that's something I'm really dealing with a lot in the work that I'm doing in my training and consulting work.
Thank you for that. So as someone who's now basically their own boss, you go from kind of the university doing some of that work, I'm assuming doing some dual duties as a consultant and professor to now full-time consultant. It feels like people are wondering, how do you do that? How do you go from that professor that does a little consulting to now full-time consultant? Can you talk a little bit about how you made that decision and what advice you would give people from the lessons you've learned over the years you've been doing the work, to anyone who's maybe grappling with that decision today?
Yeah. So I want to say for me, it was not this sort of clear path. I mean, I always had the passion and the commitment to do education around social justice issues. But where I did that kind of depended on the opportunities that were available at different times. So at one point I wanted to be a faculty and I couldn't be, and I was doing more consulting and other work and writing. When I was a faculty member, then I was doing less consulting, because that was where my focus was. So I have found that my commitment to the work has never wavered, but where and how I've been able to do it has not always felt under my control. People talk about the best laid plans. It doesn't always work out that way. And sometimes that's great because sometimes opportunities present themselves that we didn't know were going to happen. So I think my consulting work, I didn't just make a decision one day to leave a faculty job and become a full-time consultant. It was more of an evolution and gradually building the consulting practice. And I think, when people ask me about this, it's really thinking about what is your particular niche. That at this point, there are lots of people out there doing work around what we call DEI issues, diversity, equity, and inclusion, or anti-racism, or, kind of this whole field is now, blossomed. And so I think it's really, what in particular do you have to offer? What's your particular slant that you're bringing to this? And I think it's real, and thinking about what gives you passion and juice. Often I come back and I think about, as I get kind of pulled in different directions, I come back and but what really excites me? What really gets me going? What's really my gift and contribution to this work? So I think it's really important to do that reflection and see, are there ways that you can then think about how do you put yourself out in the world and in this field in that way? And using opportunities to do free stuff, where can you present at conferences? I think it's really important to get known and seen. In your local community, where can you be giving talks with different organizations? What can you write and what can you get published that people will see that establishes your credibility? So sort of branding and marketing has never been my strong suit, but I think those are some things that are helpful. And then I find the more I'm out there, the more people know me and see me, and it's word of mouth, and and so it goes. I do want to say, I think it's extremely difficult being a full-time consultant, and I've usually been a part-time consultant. Either I had another job and was doing this in addition, or I had kids and I wanted to be parenting and didn't want to be consulting full-time, or I had a partner that was also bringing in income and health insurance. So I think for people who want to be a full-time consultant, it's a huge commitment in terms of being willing to be on the road and to feel that level of financial instability, especially initially. So I think people really need to think, is this the lifestyle and career choice that makes the most sense for me, given wherever they're at in their life and their circumstances.
Yeah, that's helpful. That's helpful. I mean, it's just interesting how just the business of diversity has expanded, and you make a very good point about not really having a clear path and what ways people will make that decision, how they make that decision. Who knows? But this is helpful. That was helpful to give folks a sense of how you came about, and then also think about how they do that. I'm going to ask you about parenting because I feel like people want to know how to work with their kids around these issues. So I'm going to come back to that. But before that, what I've always enjoyed about the Diane Goodman experience is the clarity, right? The way you help people understand the terms in clear, simple, digestible ways. And so whether I was learning from you in a workshop or bringing you and asking you to work with some of the folks I was working with, I always appreciated that. And so that's what I want to ask you to do. I'm just going to give you some terms and just ask you to break them down, because I think I want people to be able to come back to this and say, I saw this on Coffee Talks, and I think it'd be really useful, because I know for me, it's always been useful whenever I'm in your presence and you are breaking down the terms. So let's start with social justice. How would you define that for folks?
I think that's creating a society, or you can break it down to an organization, where everyone has equitable access to resources, to opportunities, to power, and can fulfill their potential and feel safe. And one thing that I think is important about that in doing this work is that it means for everybody. It's not simply that folks who are currently oppressed get to experience social justice, and the folks who are now in the dominant roles get screwed. That, social justice means that all of us as human beings can fulfill our human potential and live with safety and having our needs met. So I think that for me is an important part of thinking about social justice.
And what about the difference between feminism and sexism?
Well, they're almost opposites in my mind. I mean, sexism is the oppression of women. Sexism is treating women as not full human beings and allowing them to have full rights and access to resources and power and opportunities. Feminism, to me, is the alternative to that. It's a way of saying that women are full human beings and deserve to have all rights and opportunities. Having said that, I would say feminism adds, and doing it in a world that is equitable and inclusive for everyone. It is not simply putting women in positions that are currently occupied by men within a patriarchal, hierarchical, oppressive system. So again, it's not just switching roles, it's transforming a system that makes it equitable for everyone, but ensuring that women's rights and sensibilities and things that have been ascribed to women or associated with women are things that are valued.
And what about the difference between equity and inclusion?
So, inclusion, I think about a sense of belonging, that people feel like they're valued and respected and feel like they belong. But equity goes one step further. And that's, again, more about power. That is about looking at ways that inequitable systems advantage or disadvantage different groups of people. And equity is ensuring that everyone is treated in ways that are fair, not equal, not meaning the same, but that people have equitable access, again, to resources, opportunities, power. And Verna Myers had the saying, diversity is being invited to the party and inclusion is being asked to dance. And I would say inequity is being part of the planning committee where you got to decide who got invited and what music was getting played.
Okay. Last one. What about the difference between white supremacy and white privilege?
I think of white supremacy as a larger system. I think of white supremacy as a system that's both structures and ideology that deem people who are designated as white are somehow superior to and more deserving of opportunities and resources than people who are not, and get to be in control of the institutions and systems and get to exercise domination. White privilege, I think, is a piece of that. It's a particular aspect of how white people get advantaged, usually at the expense of people of color.
Thank you. I hope this is helpful for folks and allows people to be able to rewind if necessary, write it down. But that's just the example of what I mean by just bite-sized clarity. Thank you for that.
Yeah. And I want to say something, about white supremacy, which again is a very loaded term and people hear and experience it differently. But again, one thing I think is really helpful as I try to help people understand these terms that people have often lots of reaction to is really understanding that we're talking about systems, that we're not talking about individual people, but white supremacy is a system that has been created that is based on the assumptions that people who are white and things associated with people who are white are somehow better than people of color and things associated with people of color. And then that gets embedded in all sorts of policies and practices and laws and institutions. And so it's not about the fact that I identify as white, my family is of European origin. It's not about us as individuals, as good or bad people, as people who are of European descent. That's not the problem, that we're of European descent. The problem is a system has been set up that privileges us, that sees us as somehow better than people who are from other parts of the world. And it's the system that is problematic, not being white, being classified as white or having European ancestry.
Yeah, now all of those terms, I wonder as I get to this parent question, like, is this something we should teach kids at kindergarten, at elementary school, at middle school, at high? What's your advice if parents are asking, and I'm talking about willing parents, want to do good by their kids in reference to these terms? What's your sense, what's been your experience with your kids, in fact, around teaching and learning these kinds of topics, these kinds of terms?
Yeah. From day one. In age appropriate ways. But, I try to be conscious, as a parent. My children are white, my partner is white. We have two daughters who are now young adults. But we tried to be very conscious. So from day one, the books that we were reading had people of different races represented, hopefully in appropriate ways, in a full range of ways. We were listening to different kinds of music. We were taking them to different events where they saw different cultures, different people. We live outside New York City, so obviously that made it easier. We were very careful about the media they consumed, what they were watching, the kind of toys we were buying them, the kind of dolls that were multiracial. So I think from day one, it's setting the stage that the differences among people are things that are normal and to be appreciated and valued. So even without direct teaching, there are lots of messages that kids get just by kind of what they're seeing and experiencing. And the same thing who our friends were, who I'm working with, who's coming over. So I think it's not only the verbal messages, but it's a lot of the nonverbal stuff that happens. It's listening to our conversations at the dinner table, watching the news and my partner and I talking about the news. What are we talking about? My kids was going to say joke, they still joke, that do I ever read a book that doesn't have racism in the title? So, you know, what they saw laying around.
Yeah.
And one of my parenting tips is teaching by laying things around. Because I would leave an article or a handout or a paper or a book, and I'd leave it around the kitchen or the den, and my kids would pick it up, or they'd look at it, or they'd read a few paragraphs. And so I found that that was without me, you know, being mom teaching them about racism, that they were being exposed to things.
Yeah.
And then it's having conversations. So as kids say things, as kids notice things, as things are happening in the world, is talking about and making this is just a regular topic of conversation, and helping them understand it through a lens of racial equity, through a lens of understanding racism. And I'll share two quick examples. Well, one is when I was doing some workshops in the community around whiteness and white privilege. And I was trying to put signs around to advertise it. And I asked my daughter, who was around 8 at the time, if she would come and help me put up signs. And she said yes. And she was reading what it was. And I said something about, well, not everyone understands what white privilege is, because I think I was describing it in the advertisement. And she looked at me like, what do you mean people don't know what white privilege is? And I said, well, what's white privilege? She said, well, it's like things that white people get that other people don't get. And I was like, right on, 8-year-old, you know?
Yeah.
And then I think my daughter was in middle school, and she had some spelling words. And she was like, oh, these are so easy. Like, I know these words. And I couldn't believe, like, there were kids in my class who didn't know these words. And how can they not know these words? And she was being all kind of uppity and judgmental about it. And she goes to a public school that's very diverse, racially, economically, different immigrants. So I said to her, okay, why do you think you might know these words? And we started to talk about, like, let's see. I said, how long have we been reading books to you? She's like, forever. I said, okay. I said, and what about your parents' education, right? We're both highly educated. We're native English speakers. I said, what kind of games did we play growing up? Like, we played word games and Scrabble and Boggle. You know, what kind of extracurriculars did you do? You know, what kind of places have we traveled? And so I helped her unpack all the advantages she had to get her to that point. And I said, so you're a smart kid. I said, but do you think that every other kid in your class has had these same opportunities? That their parents who English is not their first language, you know, that's not what they're speaking in the home. And, you know, we went kind of through things. And it was a way just to challenge that sense of superiority. You know, I'm better than other people, but recognizing what are the systemic external factors that have all contribute to that. That doesn't make you any better than anyone else. It just means that you had opportunities other people didn't. So I think it's always looking for opportunities to break down the dominant ideology, the mythology that, you know, supports white supremacy, and really helping people look at it more critically.
Well, I want to ask you about your publications, some of the things you've done in that area, in that arena. But before that, let's check in around COVID-19. How are you doing with this quarantine? And what's your sense of the community around you in reference to just how people are doing in reference to just being shelter in place?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's such a mix of feelings. I mean, you know, of course, it's horrific. I mean, it's horrific. It's really hard to watch the news. I have to kind of really think about what I watch and how much of it. You know, more and more I'm knowing people who are being impacted in different ways or dying in different ways. You know, it's inescapable. And I live outside New York City, and so it is around for sure. It is devastating to look at the revealing of the racial and class inequities. I'll want to come back to that. But, you know, and how it's being handled in our government. So there's lots that is deeply, deeply, deeply upsetting and outraging. And having said that, I live in a community where people have stepped up in wonderful ways, trying to find ways to contribute to folks in my community and really across the country, thinking about what can I do that would be helpful. So I feel like there are people around me that are really trying to be very caring and are. And, it just makes stark relief the inequities that exist. I mean, I feel very fortunate. We've been able to shelter in place. I'm not worried that I'm not going to have food to eat or a place to live, or I'm not going to be able to access medical care if I need it. I can go outside. I mean, it just reveals, the levels of privilege that I have that other people don't. And the ways that, racism and classism and ableism and ageism and xenophobia are just so apparent. And to me, as an educator, I think about how to use this opportunity, not only as an activist, obviously, to try to address it and to be trying to create structural change, but to use this as an educator to help people see these patterns and these dynamics that are just being so starkly revealed in this pandemic. It's nothing new in the sense of, who always ends up with the fewest opportunities and is most harmed. But it's helping people see this from a more historical perspective and from a broader analytical perspective. So this can be useful to think about, what do we need to be creating in the future? Because we're not going, we can't go back. I hope we don't go back. It's an opportunity to think about, what do we create differently? And that's the piece of hope I hold on to and I want to try to contribute to.
Yeah. I wanted to, ask you, follow up with you around that. What do you think are the next levels of the work, or what this time is telling us we need to be possibly focusing on and maybe tackling as we look ahead? But before that, can you just talk about some of the things you've already written about, what your goals were in those publications, and then, maybe spring into what you think is next, what we need to be kind of looking at as we deal with what some are calling the new normal?
So one of the earliest things I wrote about was dealing with working with people from different privilege groups, not just white folks, but men or heterosexual folks or other people from dominant groups, around how do we educate around social justice issues when people are part of dominant groups, understanding the resistance, how do we engage people? So I have a book, Promoting Diversity and Social Justice, Educating People from Privileged Groups. It's a second edition out of that. I've also been part of the book, Teaching for Diversity and Social Justice, a co-editor and contributor to that book, the third and soon, at some point, the fourth edition, and just a variety of articles, often focused on either my own reflections about being white and what that means, or about teaching about these issues, because that's really what I feel drawn towards, is how to help people, especially white folks or people from privileged groups, understand issues of oppression, and to think about how can they engage in creating more equity and changing the systems and the organizations and the communities that they're part of. So that's a lot of what my work has been. Actually, I just had an article published in the White Privilege Journal, the Understanding and Dismantling Privilege Journal, which is my model of cultural competence for equity and inclusion, or social justice is another way I call it. And that really was my attempt to take frameworks of cultural competence, which I feel mostly left out, talking about systems of inequity, talking about oppression, talking about privilege, and how to bring that into the discussions and work around cultural competency. And so I developed this framework. It has 5 components as a way to do social justice work within a framework that people were already more comfortable with.
And what do you think, what's needed now? I mean, you've done so much and contributed to so much and been at it for a while in reference to these issues. And now, we have this pandemic, it stops us, it holds us in place. it kind of gives us a chance to reflect on what's been done, where we are. What's your sense of, as you look forward, the work that needs to be done?
Yeah. So I think in the most positive way, it's an opportunity to really address the systemic inequities that have long existed. And as I said, are just so apparent at the moment, and how to capitalize on that for some really structural changes. I mean, we're talking now about universal health care in ways that we hadn't before, about basic minimum income, about some environmental and climate issues. So I am hopeful that we can use this opportunity to have people reflect and say, okay, these systems really have not worked. They have not worked well enough for enough people. And we're not going to tolerate that anymore. And that we'll be able to be creating some more progressive structures and systems that didn't seem as possible to do before. So that's what I hold out, and that's what I'm thinking about. How can I engage in supporting that? And part of that for me, again, from an educational perspective, is helping people who have not seen or understood these inequities to understand them, so they do feel more prepared and committed to being part of this progressive change. And that can be on a more systemic level, a societal level, but also within their institutions, their organizations, their colleges or universities, is really developing the capacity for people to analyze issues from an equity lens, from a racial equity lens, from a systemic and structural and intersectional perspective, so they can see things in new ways. And then also having the skills to have conversations, to do their personal work, to think about how do they make changes in their organizations. So I think this is a moment where so much has been thrown up in the air, and so much has been questioned, right? We're out of the normal. We can't go back to whatever the normal was. And so it is a moment. And a piece of my work also I want to mention is particularly with white people. So that's been a thread for as long as I've been doing this work, is particularly working with other white people to help us reflect on how have we internalized white supremacy, white superiority. How do we heal from that? How do we show up and be able to engage with people of color in solidarity for racial and social justice? So I'll continue to stay, committed to doing. And I think we always need to be doing that if we are going to be partnering with people of color and other folks around larger social justice issues.
I wanted to ask you about any projects, any future ideas you got cooking, your career over the next 10 years. I wanted to ask you to think about sharing some of what's in the future for you. But before that, I wanted to follow up on your last response about specifically working with white people. Like if you could do a PSA for white folks about this work at this time, what would be your minute or two, I don't know, inspirational words, guidance? What would you say to white people if you had 2 minutes? And I'm talking about the willing, not those who are not wanting to do the work, all that kind of stuff. I'm just saying a coalition of the willing. What would be your message to them? Your call to action?
This work is transformative. This work is liberating for everyone. That undoubtedly people of color are harmed and oppressed and dehumanized by racism. It's clear. And white people benefit in many ways from this system. And systems of oppression are dehumanizing to everyone in different ways. For white people doing this work, it is both about creating a world that's consistent with our values, where I don't think we want people to be unfairly treated, to be oppressed, to be subject to violence. And it is also work that liberates us, because for us to be participating in the system, our full humanity is damaged and limited. And doing this work, I know for me and other white folks, has been some of the most liberating, transformative, positive work, because we can be more fully human. We can live more aligned with our values. We can feel more connected to other human beings and develop authentic relationships across differences. I mean, I write about this in my book, Promoting Diversity and Social Justice, because I think so often white people see this as, oh my God, I just feel bad. I feel shame, I feel guilt, it's gonna be bad, I'm just gonna lose things. And I just wanna say to people, that's not what it's about. Like, yeah, that's some of the stuff you gotta go through. Like, this could be hard, it could be uncomfortable, like, you know, it could be painful, no doubt about it. We're gonna screw up, yeah, well, that's true. But where you get, if you hang in there, is to such a better place. And that's what I really hold out for white folks and want white folks to hear. This is about our collective liberation and the world that I think we want to live in, where all people can be free.
Thank you for that, Diane. Can you tell me, what are you going to be when you grow up? You got the next 10 years. What's on the horizon? You got publications. What you got cooking? You got something, some ideas. Think about the next 10 years. Give us a sense of what's to come.
Yeah. Well, I'm kind of looking down the barrel at, you know, I don't know how many more 10 years are going to be coming. So I am really thinking about, you know, how do I want to be spending my time, and what, you know, what I feel I can best contribute and offer. And I don't have sort of a particular project in mind. I do feel like I want to increasingly do work with white people, because I think that's really a critical piece of the work. And that's what I hear from folks of color all the time, is like, go get your people and go help white folks work out some of their stuff. So I feel committed to doing that and trying to think about ways to best do that. And I think what I have been hearing from people is, one of the things that I do, and I really appreciated what you said earlier about my ability to break things down, is that I'm often asked to work with folks who are newer to this. And I feel like if that's a role that I can play, then I feel like that's a really important space. Because it's nice to be able to use language and mobilize people who are already kind of understand a lot of these issues and are committed and motivated, and not saying that we don't always have work to do, but especially for folks who may be more scared about this, maybe just dipping their toe in, maybe just more uncertain about it. That if I can help reach those folks and help bring them on a path and a journey to be unlearning and engaging in equity and anti-oppression and liberation work, then that's something that I want to keep doing. And part of it is, like, I always feel open to see what presents itself. So I'm always interested in who's doing what and what presents itself, and I keep putting that out there, that the right things will come. And so who knows?
Yeah. Well, just know that the White Privilege Conference, the Privilege Institute, we're always open to collaborating with Diane Goodman. If there's any project on the horizon or any opportunities, and of course, you're always welcome to do your work at the White Privilege Conference. And I've appreciated you supporting me in the conference long before it was a popular thing to do, so to speak. So thank you, my friend. I appreciate that. And thank you for coming on. I want to end, because we're creating a what to watch or what to read or what to listen to list. Since people have a little extra time on their hands, whether it's something you've streamed or something you've listened to or something you've read, would you like to add anything to our list before we go?
Wow, well, I'm sure you've heard all sorts of great suggestions. I will say the New York Times did an amazing project called the 1619 Project. It's a series of podcasts and articles that I think is just wonderful. So I'll certainly do a shout out to the 1619 Project. That's when enslaved Africans were first brought to the United States. So I'll do that. I assume you've heard a lot of things from other people, so I don't know that I'll have to go down the whole list, but I'll put that one out.
Great. I know of that project, but I don't think we've had that one recommended. So thank you. We'll add that one to our list. Thank you for your time, Diane Goodman, and your patience getting us connected. We did it, and it's been definitely a pleasure to have you on. And take care of yourself out there on the outskirts of New York City, and I'll look forward to giving you a real hug. But until then, Wakanda forever.
And I do want to say, I mean, what a pleasure it is doing this with you, but how much I respect and admire your work, your vision, your determination around the conference and around putting this work out there in all the ways that you do. So I feel honored to be part of the work that you're doing, to be supporting the Privilege Institute and the White Privilege Conference, and to, be connected to you over all these years. So a deep, deep appreciation to you, Eddie.
Much love. And at least for this 10, we don't know if we got another 10, but we'll go after this 10.
One day at a time.
All right.
Take good care.
Take care. Bye-bye.